The vibration of the phone against Lena's ribs felt like a death knell. She was face down on the rug, the fibers scratching her cheek, while the room spun in nauseating tilts of gray and black. Her left arm was a foreign object now, a heavy, throbbing weight that screamed every time she tried to draw a breath. He broke my arm. Please come home. She stared at the screen, her vision tunneled. She had sent it. She had finally broken the silence. But as the delivered icon popped up, her eyes focused on the top of the chat. It wasn't Mom. It wasn't the contact photo of her mother laughing at a garden party. It was a blank gray silhouette. A 10-digit number she didn't recognize. Her heart did a slow, sickening roll in her chest. A wrong number. She had just confessed the darkest secret of the Hale household to a complete stranger. She went to type a frantic apology, her right thumb shaking so hard she hit the wrong letters. But before she could clear the field, the stranger replied. The notification banner dropped like a guillotine. Who is this? And why did you just use my family's private cipher? Lena froze. The pain in her arm was momentarily eclipsed by a cold, predatory dread. Family cipher? She didn't know what that meant. She just knew she had to fix this before Thomas heard the phone buzz from the other side of the door. I'm sorry, she typed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Wrong number. Please delete this. If he finds out I told anyone, he'll hurt my mom. Little bird is just scared. Please. Seconds passed. The silence in the house was heavy, broken only by the distant rhythmic thud-thud of Thomas's footsteps in the master bedroom downstairs. He was pacing. He was calculating. Then the stranger replied again. This time the words felt like they had physical weight. Do not delete these messages. Do not turn off your phone. I am Victor Vane. If you are the person I think you are, the man who touched you is already a ghost. Where are you? Hello to everyone watching. I am so incredibly moved that you've joined us for this story. It's a journey of unexpected protectors and the shadows that watch over the innocent. Before we see how Victor Vane, a man who usually operates in the highest echelons of power, reacts to this desperate plea from a suburban bedroom, I want to take a second to welcome you. We have viewers joining us from all corners of the globe, from the vibrant markets of Lagos to the snowy streets of Oslo. Where are you joining us from today? Please tell me in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Lena's breath hitched. Victor Vane. The name sounded like something out of a history book or a nightmare. She didn't know who he was, but the authority in his text was absolute. It wasn't the frantic worry of a mother or the cold indifference of a stranger. It was the command of a man who was used to moving mountains. She looked around her room. It was a beautiful prison. Crown molding, designer wallpaper, a plush vanity. All built by Thomas Sullivan, the man the community called a saint for his pro bono work on the local cathedral. No one saw the way he looked at Lena when her mother wasn't in the room. No one saw the way he systematically isolated them, turning their dream home into a panopticon where every floorboard was a snitch. I'm at 1422 Silver Lane, she typed, the pain making her head swim. He's downstairs. He's the contractor. Please. If you're going to help, don't let him see you. He has cameras everywhere. He says he owns the street. 30 miles away, in a penthouse that overlooked the glowing veins of the city, Victor Vane didn't flinch. He stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, the reflection of his tailored suit ghosting against the glass. He held the phone like a weapon. Little Bird. The nickname was a jagged piece of glass in his heart. 30 years ago, his mother had fled their family's business in the middle of the night, taking his baby sister with her. They had vanished into the witness protection program, scrubbed from the earth to keep them safe from the enemies Victor had spent his life dismantling. He had been told they were dead. He had been told they were in another country. But he had never stopped looking. He had spent millions on private investigators, hackers, and data analysts, searching for a single trace of the little bird he used to carry on his shoulders through the vineyards of Sicily. Silas, Victor said, not turning around. The door to the office opened. Silas, a man who looked more like a librarian than a high-level enforcer, stepped in. Sir? The car is ready for the gala. Cancel the gala, Victor said. Run a deep packet inspection on this phone number. I want the deed history for 1422 Silver Lane. I want the criminal record, the bank statements, and the search history of a man named Thomas Sullivan. And Silas. Yes, sir. Bring the surgical team. No guns. No noise. I don't want a drop of blood on the carpet. I want this man to watch his life dissolve in real time. I want him to realize he didn't just break a girl's arm, he broke a bloodline. Silas didn't ask questions. He knew that tone. It was the tone Victor used right before he erased someone from existence. Victor looked back at the phone. He could see Lena's typing bubbles appearing and disappearing. He was terrified. She was waiting for a savior she didn't know was a monster to other monsters. Lena, he wrote, using the name he had just pulled from the phone's registration. I am 20 minutes away. If he comes to your door, tell him you're sleeping. Do not let him see the phone. I am not the police and I am not your friend. I am the consequence of his actions. Hold on. Lena read the message and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. She didn't know that Victor Vane was currently the head of a syndicate that controlled the very supply chains Thomas used for his construction business. She didn't know that with a single phone call, Victor could make Thomas's permits vanish, his bank accounts freeze, and his reputation turn to ash. She just knew that for the first time in her life, the man downstairs wasn't the most dangerous person in her world. She tucked the phone under her pillow and lay back, the white-hot pain in her arm a constant pulsing reminder of what was at stake. Outside, the sky began to weep, rain lashing against the window of her beautiful, gilded cage. The contractor thought he was safe behind his walls. He didn't know that a ghost from the old world was screaming down the highway toward him, fueled by 30 years of regret and a wrong number text that had changed everything. The silence that followed Victor's last message was heavier than the darkness in Lena's room. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the floorboards. Every floorboard in this house was a snitch. Thomas had seen to that during the renovation. The 6 months where he had torn down the walls of their lives and rebuilt them with hidden cameras and sensors. To the neighbors in the leafy suburb of Oak Ridge, he was a craftsman. To Lena, he was an architect of fear. Lena's mind drifted to her mother, Sarah. Sarah was a woman made of soft edges and blind faith. When Lena's father had died 4 years ago, the light hadn't just gone out, the foundation had crumbled. Then came Thomas. He didn't just offer a shoulder to cry on, he offered a blueprint for a new life. He was a master of small-town charm, the kind of man who brought soup to sick neighbors and built the local playground for free. But once the ring was on Sarah's finger, the contractor began to renovate their freedom. Lena remembered the first time he'd raised his voice. It wasn't a shout, it was a low vibrating growl about efficiency and respect. Then came the rules. No passwords on phones that he didn't have. No friends over when he wasn't home. He told Sarah it was for their safety. The world was a dangerous place for a beautiful woman and her daughter. Sarah, desperate for the stability she'd lost, had nodded and smiled until the smile became a permanent mask of exhaustion. Lena's deepest fear wasn't for her own safety. It was that she would wake up one day and realize she had become like her mother, a ghost haunting her own hallways. Her motivation for staying quiet had always been Sarah's fragile happiness. But as the fire in her arm pulsed, Lena realized that the safety Thomas provided was just a well-decorated cage. 30 miles away, Victor Vane sat in the back of a blacked-out SUV, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon gold and predatory red. Beside him sat Silas, who was scrolling through a tablet with the clinical detachment of an accountant. Thomas Sullivan, Silas said, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine. Born in Ohio. No prior criminal record, but a trail of unfortunate accidents follows his previous business partners. 3 bankruptcies, all of which left him wealthier and his associates in debt. He's a specialist in structural manipulation, not just of buildings but of finances. He's a parasite, sir. He finds a host with assets, integrates himself, and then hollows them out from the inside. Victor didn't look at the tablet. He was looking at a faded photograph he kept in his breast pocket. It showed a young woman with the same defiant spark in her eyes that he'd sensed in Lena's texts. To Sister Claire. The girl used the name Little Bird, Victor said softly. It wasn't a guess. It was a reflex. Find the connection between Sarah Hale and Clara Vane. Silas tapped the screen. Sarah Hale's maiden name is listed as Miller. But her social security number was issued 30 years ago in a district that doesn't exist anymore. It's a classic deep cover wash. If she's your sister, she didn't just run, she was erased. And Sullivan? He didn't marry her for love. He married her because he's been tracking the Vane family assets for a decade. He thinks he's found a back door into the Vane estate. Victor's jaw tightened. The Vane family wasn't just a name. It was a legacy of power that stretched back to the old country. If Thomas Sullivan was using Lena and her mother as a bargaining chip for a fortune he didn't understand, he wasn't just an abuser. He was a thief in a lion's den. "He doesn't know who I am?" Victor asked. "To him you're a myth. A boogeyman the construction unions whisper about," Silas replied. "He thinks he's playing a game of checkers with a housewife. He has no idea he's stepped onto a board where the king moves in every direction." Victor checked his watch. "He's a contractor. He likes systems. He likes control. We won't give him the satisfaction of a fight. We will give him a total system failure." Back at 1422 Silver Lane, the light in the hallway flickered. Lena heard the heavy tread of Thomas's boots approaching her door. She shoved the phone deep under her pillow and squeezed her eyes shut, trying to regulate her breathing. The door creaked open. The scent of scotch and mint filled the room. "I know you're awake, Lena," Thomas said, his voice a smooth, terrifying purr. He didn't turn on the light. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette of a man who looked perfect in a suit but was hollowed out by greed. "I'm going to check on your mother now. She's tired. She's had a long day at the shop. It would be a shame if she had to wake up to a daughter who couldn't keep her mouth shut." He walked toward the bed. Lena felt the mattress sink as he sat on the edge. He reached out and stroked her hair, a gesture that made her skin crawl. "I built this room for you. I put the best insulation in these walls. Do you know why? Because I wanted you to feel safe. I wanted you to know that no matter what happens outside, I'm the one who keeps the roof over your head." His hand moved closer to her broken arm. Lena's breath hitched. "Don't forget who gave you everything, little bird," he whispered. The use of the nickname, his mockery of her mother's secret name for her, was a physical blow. Thomas didn't know the history of that name. He only knew it was a point of vulnerability he could exploit. As he stood up and left the room, locking the door behind him, Lena pulled the phone out. Her hand was shaking so hard she almost dropped it. She saw a new message from the stranger, "Victor. He just entered your room. I saw the thermal signature change. He's gone now. You're doing brave work, Lena. The walls he built are about to become his own cage. Do not move." Lena stared at the screen. Thermal signature? Who was this man? He wasn't just a wrong number. He was a god in the machine watching her from the sky. For the first time, the fear of Thomas was met with an equal opposite force. The war wasn't just in her house anymore. It was everywhere. The air in the bedroom suddenly felt heavy, charged with the static of an approaching storm. Lena's phone buzzed with a low, insistent vibration. It wasn't a text this time. It was a link. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she tapped it. A live video feed bloomed onto her screen, grainless and hauntingly clear. It was a bird's-eye view of her own house, rendered in the spectral blues and violets of a high-grade thermal camera. She saw the heat signature of Thomas in the kitchen, a bright, angry orange smear, and her mother, Sarah, a faint, flickering yellow pulse in the living room. Then she saw the shadows. 4 distinct, cold black figures were moving with rhythmic military precision across the backyard. They didn't jump the fence, they seemed to flow over it. They didn't trip the motion lights Thomas had installed last spring. In fact, as they approached the perimeter, the lights didn't just stay off. They went dark entirely. The glowing red active lights on the security cameras throughout the property blinked out in a perfect, synchronized line, like a row of dominoes falling in the dark. "Watch the kitchen," a text flashed from Victor. On the screen, Thomas was pouring another drink, his back to the window. He looked like a king in his counting house, oblivious to the fact that his kingdom had just been deplatformed. Suddenly, the power in the entire house died. Not a flicker but a hard, absolute kill. The hum of the refrigerator, the whine of the HVAC, the glow of the stove clock, all vanished. "Sarah." Thomas's voice boomed from downstairs, stripped of its polished veneer. It was the roar of a man who hated losing control of even the smallest light bulb. "What did you do? Did you trip the breaker with that damn space heater?" Lena pressed her face against the door, her broken arm throbbing in time with the heavy thud of Thomas's boots as he stomped toward the basement stairs. This was it. The moment the stranger had promised. But the fear hadn't left her. It had transformed. She was no longer just afraid of what Thomas would do to her. She was terrified of the ghost she had summoned into their lives. In the basement, Thomas fumbled for the fuse box, his flashlight cutting a frantic, shaky path through the dark. He reached for the metal handle, but as his fingers touched the casing, his phone began to scream. Not a ringtone, but a piercing, high-frequency emergency alert. He pulled it out, squinting at the screen. It wasn't a weather alert. It was a bank notification. Account terminated. Assets frozen. Pending investigation for racketeering and structural fraud. What the hell? Thomas hissed, his thumb frantic on the screen. He tried to log in, but the app was gone. In its place was a single image. A wooden pendant of a bird, carved in a style he hadn't seen since his childhood in the old neighborhoods. Above him, the floorboards didn't creak. They remained silent. That was the most terrifying part. Victor's team wasn't here to make a scene. They were here to perform an extraction of his very soul. Down in the dark, a voice came from the shadows behind the furnace. It wasn't Victor's, but it carried the same icy weight. The concrete you used for the St. Jude's Foundation was 40% ash, Thomas. The city inspector who signed off on it just took a plea deal 5 minutes ago. You aren't a contractor anymore. You're a liability. Thomas spun around, swinging his flashlight, but the beam hit only empty air. Who's there? I'll kill you. I built this house. I own every inch of this dirt. You own a debt you can't pay, the voice replied, seemingly from everywhere at once. Upstairs, the door to Lena's room didn't just unlock. The hinges were silently unscrewed from the outside by a man in a tactical mask. He didn't say a word. He leaned in, saw Lena on the floor, and signaled to a second man who carried a specialized medical kit. Don't scream, little bird, the first man whispered. The boss is on the line. He handed Lena an earpiece. She pressed it to her ear, her breath hitching. Lena, Victor's voice was no longer a text. It was a deep, resonant reality. My men are going to stabilize your arm. I need you to go to your mother. She is in the kitchen. She is confused, and she is about to see the man she married for who he truly is. I have sent a file to her phone. I need you to be there when she opens it. Who are you? Lena whispered, tears finally spilling over as the medic began to wrap her arm in a pressurized cooling cast that numbed the fire instantly. I am the brother she thought was a memory, Victor said. And I am the uncle you never knew you had. Now go. The contractor is about to lose his last contract. Lena stood up, her legs wobbly. The medic stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, vanishing as if he were made of smoke. She walked toward the stairs, the house feeling strange and cavernous without the hum of electricity. She reached the kitchen where her mother, Sarah, was standing by the window, clutching her phone. Sarah looked at Lena, her eyes wide with terror. Lena, the power, and Thomas is in the basement screaming, and I just got this email. From someone named Vane. Open it, Mom, Lena said, her voice stronger than she ever thought possible. Sarah tapped the screen. It wasn't a legal document. It was a video from 30 years ago. A graining, sun-drenched clip of a little girl in a white dress, laughing as a tall, dark-haired boy swung her around in an olive grove. The boy in the video leaned into the camera and whispered, "Don't worry, little bird. I'll always find you." Sarah's phone clattered to the floor. She looked at Lena, then at the basement door, where the sounds of a man losing his mind echoed up the vents. The mask of the suburban wife shattered. The trauma she had suppressed for 3 decades, the reason she had run, the reason she had hidden, and the reason she had let a man like Thomas control her, came rushing back. "Victor," she whispered. At that moment, the basement door kicked open. Thomas stumbled out, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He saw Lena standing there, her arm in a high-tech cast, and Sarah holding the phone. He saw the look of recognition in his wife's eyes, and he knew the game was up. "I don't know who's messing with my life," Thomas snarled, reaching for a heavy glass vase on the counter. "But I'm going to start by making sure you two never speak to anyone again." He lunged. But he didn't reach them. The kitchen window didn't break. It simply vanished as a flashbang detonated in the backyard, and 3 red laser dots appeared simultaneously on Thomas's chest. He froze, the vase trembling in his hand. "Drop it," a voice commanded from the darkness of the dining room. The red dots on Thomas's chest danced like blood-hungry fireflies. He stood paralyzed, the heavy crystal vase slipping from his white-knuckled grip and shattering against the tile. The sound was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the powerless kitchen. Sarah gasped, pulling Lena behind her, her body instinctively acting as a shield for the first time in years. The air in the room didn't just feel cold. It felt pressurized, as if the house itself were being squeezed by an invisible hand. Outside, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, lashing against the windows. Through the glass, the silhouettes of Victor's men were motionless, statues of obsidian against the gray blur of the storm. They weren't moving to arrest him. They were waiting. They were a perimeter, a physical manifestation of the fact that Thomas Sullivan's world had shrunk to the four walls of this kitchen. "Who are you?" Thomas hissed, his voice cracking. He looked at the laser dots, then at the darkened corners of the dining room where the voice had originated. "I have friends. I have people in the mayor's office. You can't just break into a private residence. Your friends are currently being briefed on your offshore accounts, Thomas," a new voice answered. This one was different. It wasn't the tactical coldness of the men in the yard. It was a voice of refined iron, smooth and terrifyingly calm. The back door, which Thomas had reinforced with a triple bolt system, swung open. It didn't break, it simply yielded. Victor Vane stepped into the kitchen. He didn't look like a vigilante. He wore a charcoal overcoat that shimmered with rainwater, his hair perfectly swept back, his eyes two chips of frozen flint. He didn't look at Thomas. He didn't even acknowledge the man with the lasers on his heart. Victor's gaze locked onto Sarah. The silence that stretched between them was 30 years long. It was filled with the scent of olive groves, the sound of a mother's muffled sobs in the middle of the night, and the weight of a wooden bird pendant. Sarah's breath hitched, a small, broken sound escaping her lips. "Clara?" Victor asked softly. "Victor," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. You were supposed to be part of the life I left behind. They told me everyone was gone. I am the only one who stayed," Victor said, finally stepping fully into the light of the emergency lanterns his men had placed on the counters. "And I have been looking for my little bird since the day the sky fell." Victor finally turned his head. The shift was predatory. Thomas flinched, his back hitting the refrigerator with a dull thud. The contractor, who had spent months gaslighting a teenager and intimidating a widow, now looked like a cornered rat in a designer polo shirt. "You," Victor said, the word a low growl. "You found a woman hiding from a past she didn't deserve, and you decided she was a treasure chest you could pry open with a crowbar." "I loved her," Thomas shouted, the lie sounding hollow and tinny in the presence of a man like Victor. "I gave them everything. This house, the shop, I built all of it." "You built a mausoleum," Victor countered, stepping closer. One of his men stepped out of the shadows, handing Victor a tablet. "Let's talk about what you really built, Thomas. You didn't just marry Sarah. You started moving her inheritance, the trust her father set up before the accident, into shell companies based in the Caymans. You were waiting for the 5-year mark, weren't you? The point where the legal windows closed and you could disappear with the Vane legacy, leaving them with nothing but a pile of debt and a broken house." Thomas's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about. That's business. Legitimate business." "And the arm." Victor's voice dropped an octave, becoming something truly dangerous. He looked at Lena, who was leaning against her mother, her face pale but her eyes fixed on Victor. Was breaking a 17-year-old girl's arm legitimate business too? "She fell," Thomas lied, his eyes darting toward the back door. "It was an accident. Ask her." Victor looked at Lena. He didn't prompt her. He didn't pressure her. He simply waited. Lena felt her mother's hand tighten on her shoulder. 4 months she had lived in a world where the truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had been told that her voice would destroy her mother's life. But looking at Victor, looking at the men in the shadows who moved like parts of a single lethal machine, she realized the truth was the only weapon she had left. "He did it because I saw him looking at Mom's private papers," Lena said, her voice clear and unwavering. "He told me if I said anything he'd make sure we were homeless. He's been hurting us for a long time, Victor. Not just with his hands. With everything." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Victor didn't explode. He didn't scream. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of black leather gloves, pulling them on slowly, finger by finger. "Silas," Victor said. "Yes, sir." Silas appeared at the doorway. I want the forensic accountants to start the deconstruction phase. Every nail this man has driven into this city, I want it pulled out. I want his permits revoked. I want his subcontractors to sue him for every cent. I want the IRS to live in his pockets for the next decade. And the physical matter, sir? Silas asked. Victor looked at Thomas, who was now trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. The physical matter is a domestic issue. But since he likes renovating so much, I think we should show him what it's like to live in a structure that's truly unstable. You can't do this. Thomas screamed. I'll call the police. The police are currently at your office, Thomas. Victor smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Lena had ever seen. They found the irregularities in the blueprints for the St. Jude's project. You know, the one where you swapped high-grade steel for recycled scrap? The building is being condemned as we speak. You aren't just a bad husband, Thomas. You're a mass murderer in waiting. Victor turned back to Sarah and Lena. Pack a bag. You're leaving this house. It's tainted. My sister and my niece do not live in places built by cowards. As Lena turned to go upstairs, she saw Thomas sink to his knees. He wasn't being hit. He wasn't being shot. He was watching his entire identity, the prestige, the money, the power, vaporize in the presence of a man who actually possessed those things. The rising tension wasn't over. It was just shifting from the physical to the psychological. Victor Vane hadn't come to just save them. He had come to reclaim them. And as Lena looked back at the contractor one last time, she realized that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't a man with a hammer. It was a man with a memory. The drive away from 1422 Silver Lane was silent, the hum of the SUV's tires against the wet pavement the only sound in the pressurized cabin. Lena sat in the middle row, her arm resting in the high-tech sling, while her mother, Sarah, stared out the window as if the suburbs they were passing were a foreign country. Up front, Victor Vane sat like a statue, his presence radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. They weren't going to a hotel. They were heading toward the Old Quarter, a district of the city where the buildings were made of stone that had survived wars and the streetlights were spaced just far enough apart to hide the men who guarded them. They arrived at a sprawling estate hidden behind iron gates draped in ivy. As the doors opened, a young man stepped forward to meet the car. He didn't look like Victor's tactical team. He wore a simple dark sweater and moved with a fluid, restless energy. This was Julian Rossi, the son of Victor's late consigliere and a man whose mind for data was as sharp as Victor's mind for power. Julian opened the car door, his eyes immediately finding Lena's. There was a moment of stillness, a spark of something that wasn't fear or pain. Julian didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with a fierce, protective curiosity. He reached out a hand to help her out of the SUV, his touch steady and grounding. I've got the secure wing ready, Julian said to Victor, though his gaze lingered on Lena a second too long. The medical staff is on standby. And Victor, the deep dive on the Hale files? I found the ghost. It's not what we thought. Victor's eyes narrowed. The study. Now. In the dimly lit study, surrounded by walls of leather-bound books and flickering monitors, Victor, Sarah, and Lena stood as Julian pulled up a series of encrypted documents. Lena felt a strange pull toward Julian, a sense that he was the only one in this room who truly understood the digital trail she had inadvertently started with her wrong number text. Everyone believed Lena's father, David Hale, died in a standard car accident 4 years ago, Julian began, his voice low and urgent. The police report was clean. The insurance payout was settled. But when I bypassed the local server at the contractor's office, I found a set of blueprints that shouldn't exist. They weren't for a house. They were for a hydraulic brake line bypass. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. What are you saying? David Hale wasn't just a librarian, Sarah, Victor said, his voice like a gavel. He was the one who helped you run 30 years ago. He was the one who scrubbed your identity. He was a master of information, and he was keeping a ledger. A ledger that contained the names of every man who had ever tried to profit from the Vane family's disappearance. Julian tapped a key and a photo appeared on the screen. It was Thomas Sullivan, but 10 years younger, standing next to a man Lena didn't recognize. A man with a scar running through his eyebrow. Thomas didn't meet you by accident, Mom, Lena whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. He wasn't a savior. He was a hunter. Exactly, Julian confirmed, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and admiration for the girl standing before him. Thomas worked for the rival families, the ones who wanted the Vane assets. He was sent to find you. But David Hale found him first. David didn't just hide you, he blackmailed Thomas, forcing him to keep your location a secret in exchange for his life. But 4 years ago Thomas found a way to win. He didn't just kill David. He stepped into his life. He waited for the grief to make you vulnerable, and then he moved in to finish the job. The room went cold. The midpoint revelation wasn't just that Thomas was a villain. It was that Lena's entire life for the last 4 years had been a scripted play, directed by the man who had murdered her father. Sarah sank into a chair, her face ghost white. The man she had let into her bed, the man she had allowed to discipline her daughter, was the architect of their tragedy. "There's more," Julian said, looking at Victor. "Thomas has been transmitting data from this house to an external server every night at 3 a.m. He wasn't just stealing money. He was mapping your sister's DNA profile. He was preparing to sell the little bird to the highest bidder on the dark web. He was going to auction off the location of the last Vane heirs." Victor's hand tightened on the back of Sarah's chair until the wood groaned. "He's not just a contractor. He's a broker. And he's been using my niece's blood as his currency." Lena felt a surge of nausea, but Julian was there, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "We caught him in time, Lena. The text you sent, it didn't just go to the wrong number. It bypassed the encryption Thomas had on your phone. Because you were in pain, your thumbprint was irregular. It triggered a secondary emergency protocol your father had hidden in your OS years ago. It sought out the one number in the world David Hale knew would never stop looking for you." Lena looked at Victor, the Mafia boss, the stranger, her uncle. The man she had feared was actually the only person her father had trusted with her life. "The auction goes live in 3 hours, Julian said, his face hardening. "The buyers are already logging in. They think they're buying a secret. They don't know they're about to be met by the Vane family's full weight." Victor looked at Lena. "You've been a pawn in a game you didn't know you were playing. But the midpoint is over. From here on we stop being the hunted." He turned to Julian. "Prepare the digital counterstrike. If they want a piece of the Vane family, we'll give them exactly what they deserve. And Julian, sir, keep her safe. If a single hair on her head is touched, I'll burn this city to the ground." Julian nodded, his eyes meeting Lena's with a promise that felt more real than anything Thomas had ever said. The revelation had changed the direction of the story entirely. It was no longer just about a girl with a broken arm. It was about a war for a legacy, and the girl who had unknowingly held the key all along. The stakes were at their highest. The betrayal was absolute. And as the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., Lena realized that the little bird was finally learning how to sharpen her beak. The storm outside the Vane estate didn't just howl. It screamed as if the sky itself were protesting the secrets being unearthed in the study. While Victor and his tactical team moved to the basement to initiate the digital counterstrike, Julian led Lena toward a reinforced panic room hidden behind the library's mahogany shelves. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and ozone. Lena's arm was a dull, heavy ache, but the adrenaline in her system was a cold, sharp blade. "Stay here," Julian whispered, his hands steady on her shoulders. "This room is built to withstand a siege. Victor is going to draw them out into the digital net, but if any of Thomas's buyers are local, they might try a physical grab. They're desperate, Lena. A secret like yours is worth more than gold to men who live in the dark." "But what about you?" Lena asked, her voice trembling. "Julian, you're just a programmer. You're not a soldier." Julian offered a thin ghost of a smile. "In this family, Lena, information is the most lethal weapon there is. I'm not going to fight them with a gun. I'm going to erase them with a keystroke. Just wait for the green light on the console. If it turns red, hit the deadbolt and don't open it for anyone but Victor." He stepped out and the heavy door hissed shut, sealing Lena in a high-tech tomb of silence. She watched him through the security monitor, a flickering black and white feed of the library. She saw him sit at the main terminal, his fingers flying across the keys. But then the screen glitched. A jagged line of static tore through the image, and a new window popped up, bypassing the estate's internal security. It was Thomas. He wasn't in a basement or a jail cell. He was in a moving vehicle, his face lit by the sickly blue glow of a tablet. His eyes were bloodshot, the mask of the contractor, completely shattered to reveal the animal underneath. "Did you think it would be that easy, Lena?" His voice crackled through the panic room's speakers. "Did you think your uncle's money could stop a contract that was signed in blood 10 years ago? I didn't just build your house. I built the sensors in your mother's jewelry. I know exactly where you are. And the people I sold you to? They don't care about veins, surgical takedowns. They just want the asset." On the monitor, the library doors didn't open. They exploded. Two men in tactical gear, not Victor's men but something cruder, more violent, rushed in. Julian didn't even have time to stand up before a flashbang detonated, filling the screen with a blinding whitewash. Lena screamed, her hand flying to the monitor as if she could pull him into the safety of the panic room. When the smoke cleared, Julian was on the floor, struggling to reach a silent alarm. One of the intruders kicked him squarely in the ribs, a sickening thud that echoed through the speakers. Lena watched in horror as they dragged him toward the exit. He wasn't the target, but he was the leverage. Then the panic room door groaned. Thomas hadn't sent his men to kill Julian. He had sent them to bypass the lock. Using a specialized thermal drill, likely a tool he'd stolen from a high-security construction site, they began to eat through the reinforced steel. The sparks showered against the interior of the door like a fountain of fire. "Open it, Lena." Thomas's voice came again, closer now, echoing from the hallway. "If you open it now, I'll let the boy live. If I have to come in there, I'll make sure your uncle watches what I do to both of you." Lena was alone. The silence of the panic room was now her enemy. She looked at the console Julian had pointed out. The light was a steady, mocking red. She looked at the medical kit the medic had left her, a simple bag of gauze and local anesthetics. She was a 17-year-old girl with a broken arm and a legacy she didn't want. She thought of her father. She thought of David Hale, the librarian who had outsmarted a Mafia family for 30 years. He hadn't used guns. He had used the system. "Julian," she whispered, looking at the monitor where he lay crumpled near the door. She reached for the terminal. She didn't know how to code like Julian, but she knew the one thing Thomas Sullivan couldn't resist: a bigger payout. Her fingers, though shaking, found the external broadcast button Julian had been using to track the auction. She opened the audio line. "Thomas," she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute calm that she had inherited from the Vane bloodline. "You told your buyers I was a secret. But I just hit public. Every major news outlet, every federal agency, and every rival family in the country just received my DNA profile and your current GPS coordinates. You aren't selling an asset anymore. You're hosting a target practice session." On the monitor, Thomas froze. He looked at his tablet, his eyes widening as he saw the auction site flood with invalid pings. Lena hadn't actually sent the data. She didn't have the permissions, but she had mimicked the upload sequence Julian had shown her earlier. She was gaslighting the gaslighter. But the victory was short-lived. "Nice try, little bird," Thomas snarled. He nodded to his men. The drill punched through the last layer of steel. The door swung open with a heavy, metallic clang. Thomas stepped into the panic room. He looked at Lena, his face a map of pure, unadulterated hatred. He reached out and grabbed her broken arm, squeezing the cast until Lena cried out, the white-hot pain returning with a vengeance. "You're coming with me," he whispered. "We're going to a place where your uncle can't find you. And since you like public displays so much, I think I'll leave your friend Julian as a message for the Vane family." He dragged her out of the room, past the unconscious Julian and into the rain-soaked night. As the black van sped away from the estate, Lena looked back at the iron gates. The lights of the mansion were flickering. Victor was still in the basement, unaware that the heart of his family had just been ripped out again. The situation was hopeless. Lena was in the back of a van with her tormentor. Her only ally was bleeding out on a library floor, and the wrong number that had saved her was now a silent piece of glass in Thomas's pocket. The interior of the van was a tomb of recycled air and the smell of industrial grease. Lena sat huddled against the cold metal ribbing of the vehicle's wall, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Every jolt of the suspension sent a fresh wave of agony through her arm, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow, terrifying silence in her chest. Thomas sat opposite her, the glow of his phone illuminating a face that no longer resembled a human being. It was a mask of pure, desperate greed. You think you're so smart, Lena, he muttered, his thumb scrolling through encrypted chats with the frantic energy of a man watching his life's work evaporate. You think that text message changed the world? It didn't. It just accelerated the timeline. By the time your uncle finishes his little digital sweep, you'll be on a private freighter headed for international waters. I'll be a ghost and you'll be a commodity. Lena didn't answer. She was looking at the small glowing blue LED on the side of her medical cast. It was faint, barely visible beneath the translucent mesh, but it was pulsing. Pulse, pulse, pulse. It was the heartbeat of a savior she hadn't seen coming. Back at the Vane estate, the library was no longer a scene of defeat. Julian Rossi sat on the floor, a streak of blood drying on his temple, but his hands were steady on a ruggedized laptop. Victor Vane stood over him, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the flickering monitors. "I've got her, Victor," Julian said, his voice raw but focused. "When I was putting on that cast, I didn't just use medical-grade polymer. I used a subdermal resonant tracker. It doesn't use GPS or cellular. Those are too easy to jam. It uses the city's own structural vibrations. It's a technology her father and I were developing in secret. Thomas is taking her to the old Foundry district, the bridge project he abandoned 3 years ago." Victor's eyes lit with a cold, predatory fire. "The bridge. It's a skeleton. No cameras, no witnesses, and 1,000 places to hide a body. Or 1,000 places to set a trap," Julian countered. He stood up, wincing as his bruised ribs protested. "He's going there because he thinks it's his turf. He built the foundation. He knows the weak points. But he doesn't know that I've already hacked into the structural sensors he installed for the city. I can turn that bridge into a prison in 3 seconds." Victor reached out and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. It was the first time the Mafia boss had shown a shred of genuine human connection. "You did well, Julian. You protected the little bird. Now let's go show that contractor what happens when a foundation is built on lies." In the van, the motion suddenly stopped. The heavy sliding door was thrown open, revealing a landscape of rusted steel and skeletal girders. The rain was still falling, turning the construction site into a labyrinth of mud and shadows. Thomas grabbed Lena by the collar of her jacket, hauling her out of the van. "This is it, Lena," he snarled, dragging her toward the center of the unfinished bridge. "The Great Vane legacy ends on a pile of scrap metal. I'm going to record the handover. Your uncle will see you go, and he'll know that for all his power he couldn't stop a man with a hammer." He pushed her toward a rusted shipping container that sat precariously near the edge of the drop-off into the churning river below. But as he reached for his phone to signal the buyers, the site's floodlights suddenly roared to life. It wasn't a flickering, accidental light. It was a blinding, surgical white that turned the night into day. Thomas shielded his eyes, stumbling back. "What? Who's there?" "My men." "Your men are currently being processed by the very system you tried to cheat, Thomas." A voice boomed from the overhead speakers. It was Julian's voice, amplified by the site's emergency PA system. "I've triggered the structural failure alarm for the entire district. The police are coming, but they aren't the ones you should be worried about." From the shadows at the far end of the bridge, a single figure emerged. Victor Vane didn't have a gun. He didn't have a team of tactical killers behind him this time. He walked with a slow, measured pace, his charcoal coat flapping in the wind. He looked like a god of the old world come to reclaim a debt. "You like building things, Thomas," Victor said, his voice cutting through the roar of the rain. "But you forgot the most important rule of architecture. If the foundation is rotten, the whole thing comes down." Thomas pulled a small, concealed pistol from his waistband, pointing it shakily at Victor. "Stay back. I'll kill her. I'll drop her into the river." "Go ahead," Victor said, his voice eerily calm. "But before you do, check your phone. Not the one you're using to call your buyers. The one linked to your offshore accounts." Thomas's eyes darted to his screen. A single message sat there, glowing in the dark. "Balance, $0. Status, deceased. You aren't a broker anymore, Thomas," Victor continued, stepping closer, ignoring the gun. "I've bought your debt. I've bought your buyers. The people you were waiting for, they work for me now. They were never coming to save you. They were coming to deliver you to me." The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. The gun trembled in his hand. He looked at Lena, then at Victor, and then at the dark, rushing water below. He was a man who had spent his life building cages for others, only to realize he had built the most effective one for himself. "Julian now," Victor commanded. Suddenly, the shipping container behind Lena didn't just move, it shrieked. Julian, operating the site's heavy crane from a remote terminal miles away, swung the massive hook into the container, dragging it away from Lena with a roar of tearing metal. Lena didn't wait. She used the momentary distraction to drive her heavy, polymer-reinforced cast directly into Thomas's solar plexus. It wasn't the move of a victim, it was the move of a vein. Thomas doubled over, the air leaving his lungs in a sickening wheeze. Victor was on him in a second. He didn't use the gun. He used his hands, the same hands that had built a criminal empire. He disarmed Thomas with a clinical snap of the wrist and pinned him against a rusted girder. "You broke her arm," Victor whispered, his face inches from Thomas's. "I'm going to break your world." But Victor didn't strike. Instead, he looked at Lena. "He's yours, little bird," Victor said. "Do we give him to the water or do we give him to the truth?" Lena stood tall, the rain washing the blood and dirt from her face. She looked at the man who had terrified her for months, the man who had murdered her father and tried to sell her soul. He looked small now. Pathetic. A man made of ash and scrap metal. "The water is too clean for him," Lena said, her voice echoing with a strength that made Victor smile. "Give him the truth. Give him the cell he built for us." At that moment, the sirens of the police and the FBI, drawn by the structural alarms Julian had tripped, filled the air. But they weren't here to rescue Thomas. They were here to arrest the man whose entire business empire had just been exposed as a fraud on every local and national news station. The turning point was complete. The hunted had become the hunter, and the little bird had finally found her wings in the middle of a storm. As the authorities swarmed the site, Victor draped his coat over Lena's shoulders. Julian's voice came over the radio, soft and relieved. "I've got you, Lena. You're safe. We're all coming home." The bridge was still a skeleton, but for the first time in years the foundation was solid. The interrogation room was a windowless box of reinforced concrete and flickering fluorescent light, a stark contrast to the sprawling skeletal grandeur of the bridge. Thomas Sullivan sat bolted to a metal chair, his hands cuffed to the table. The contractor had tried to regain his composure. He had spent the last 3 hours demanding his lawyer, shouting about civil rights, and insisting that the Vane family was a myth fabricated by a delusional teenager. "I have a reputation," Thomas screamed at the two detectives on the other side of the glass. "I've built half the city. You can't hold me on the word of a girl who fell down the stairs." But the detectives weren't the ones he should have been worried about. The door to the interrogation room didn't open with a knock. It hummed as the electronic lock was bypassed by a remote signal. Victor Vane stepped inside, followed by Julian Rossi. Julian carried a sleek, brushed aluminum briefcase, while Victor carried the weight of a century of silent power. "The detectives are taking a very long coffee break, Thomas," Victor said, his voice a calm, terrifying vibration in the small room. "You can't be in here." Thomas scrambled back as far as the bolts in the chair would allow. "This is a police station. There are cameras." Julian tapped a key on his tablet and the monitors in the corner of the room went black. "The cameras are currently on a loop of an empty room, Thomas. And the digital recorders? They've been replaced with a white noise frequency that effectively erases everything said in the last 10 minutes. For all intents and purposes, you are currently in a void." Victor sat across from Thomas, leaning forward until their faces were inches apart. "You tried to sell my niece, Thomas. You tried to auction off a human life like it was a surplus of timber. Do you know what happens to brokers who fail to deliver on a Vane contract? I don't care about your fairy tales." Thomas spat, though his lip was trembling. "My lawyers will have me out by morning. The blueprints for St. Jude's? That's a civil matter. The arm? Domestic dispute. You have nothing." "We have everything," Julian said, opening the briefcase. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a single ancient-looking ledger and a stack of modern high-definition photographs. The photos weren't of the bridge or the house. They were of a small graveyard in Ohio. Specifically, a headstone for a man named David Hale. "This is the climax, Thomas," Julian continued, his voice steady. "When we were at the foundry you thought I was just tracking Lena. But I was also running a deep tissue scan on the soil samples you had in the back of your van. You see, contractors always keep a little bit of the job site with them. And in the wheel wells of your vehicle, we found a very specific type of lime-treated clay. The kind used in the foundation of the library where Lena's father worked. Thomas's eyes darted to the photos. So what? I worked there. It's public record. It's the composition of the clay, Julian said, his eyes hardening. It contained traces of a hydraulic fluid, the same fluid used in the brake lines of David Hale's car. The car that, accidentally, went off the road 4 years ago. You didn't just sabotage the car, Thomas. You buried the evidence in the very foundation you were paid to repair. You literally built your new life on top of his grave. Victor reached out and tapped the ledger. And this is the ledger David Hale kept. He knew you were coming. He knew you were a hunter. He didn't just hide Sarah. He recorded every payment you ever received from the rival families. He documented the permit fees you paid to local officials to look the other way while you used substandard materials. You didn't kill a librarian, Thomas. You killed a man who had already won. Thomas looked at the ledger, and for the first time the defiance vanished. He looked at the paper as if it were a poisonous snake. He was supposed to be a nobody. In this family no one is a nobody, Victor said. Now, Julian said, turning the tablet toward Thomas. The legal maneuver you were hoping for? It just failed. Because 5 minutes ago the FBI, who we gave a very specific tip-off to, found the secondary storage unit you kept in the industrial district. The one containing the original unedited blueprints for the city's new bridge. The one that proves you've been embezzling millions in public funds to pay off your gambling debts to the very people you tried to sell Lena to. You're a dead man, Thomas, Victor whispered. Legally, financially, and socially. But I'm not going to kill you. That would be too quick. Instead, I've made sure you're going to a very specific federal facility. One where the contractor, who cut corners on prison construction, is well known to the inmates. You'll be living in the very structures you built with ash and greed. Thomas began to sob, a pathetic sniveling sound that filled the small room. He reached out to grab Victor's sleeve, but Victor pulled away with a look of pure disgust. Wait, please. I can give you names. I can tell you who else was in on the auction. I already have the names, Victor said, standing up. Julian has already initiated the total system failure for every buyer on that list. Their accounts are being drained, their secrets are being leaked, and their assets are being seized by the Vane estate as we speak. You weren't a player, Thomas. You were the bait. I used your greed to find the people who have been hunting my sister for 30 years. And now, thanks to you, the war is finally over. Victor walked to the door, pausing as the lock clicked open. He looked back one last time. By the way, Thomas, my niece, she didn't just send that text to the wrong number. She sent it to the only number. She has the Vane blood in her. She knew, even in her pain, who to call to finish what her father started. The climactic resolution didn't end with a bang, but with the heavy, final thud of the interrogation room door closing for the last time. Thomas Sullivan was left in the dark, a man who had tried to build a kingdom on a foundation of bone and lies, only to realize that the architect of his destruction was the very girl he had tried to break. Outside, the sun was beginning to peek through the clouds, a pale, golden light washing over the city. Lena and Sarah were waiting in the lobby of the station. When Victor and Julian emerged, Lena didn't look at the files or the ledgers. She looked at Julian, and for the first time since the night began, she smiled. It was a smile of authentic, hard-won victory. The little bird had survived the storm, and the cage was finally, permanently broken. Julian walked over to her, handing her a small wooden bird pendant, the same one from the video which Victor had recovered from Thomas's safe. This belongs to you, Lena. It's been waiting a long time to come home. Lena took the pendant, her fingers closing over the smooth, ancient wood. She felt the connection to her father, to her mother's past, and to the future she was finally allowed to have. What happens now? She asked, looking at Victor. Now, Victor said, his eyes softening as he looked at his sister. We rebuild. But this time we used the right materials. The resolution was complete. The villain was dismantled, the family was reunited, and the truth had been forged in the fire of a single desperate text message. The morning air at the Vane estate was no longer heavy with the scent of secrets and wet stone. Instead, it smelled of sea salt and blooming jasmine, carried on a breeze that felt like a long-overdue exhale. 3 months had passed since the night of the storm. 3 months since a single text message had dismantled a decades-long conspiracy and brought the little bird back to her nest. Lena stood on the wide stone terrace, her left arm now free of the high-tech cast. There was a faint, silvery scar near her wrist, a permanent map of the night she found her strength, but the fire was gone. In its place was a steady, quiet hum of purpose. She looked out over the sprawling gardens where her mother, Sarah, was walking with Victor. Watching them together was like watching two halves of a broken photograph finally being taped back together. Sarah didn't wear the mask of the suburban wife anymore. Her hair was loose, catching the sunlight, and her laughter, once a rare and fragile thing, now echoed clearly against the estate's walls. They weren't talking about the Mafia or the money, or the man currently serving a life sentence in a high-security cell. They were talking about the olive groves of their childhood, reclaiming the memories that Thomas Sullivan had tried to overwrite. "You're thinking too loud again," a voice said from behind her. Lena turned to see Julian Rossi leaning against the stone balustrade. He looked different than he had in the library that night. The shadows under his eyes were gone, and he had traded his tactical sweaters for a simple linen shirt. He held 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Lena with a familiar, easy grace. "I was just thinking about the wrong number," Lena said, taking a sip. "If I had typed even 1 digit differently, I'd still be in that house. Or worse." Julian stepped closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "I don't believe in wrong numbers anymore, Lena. I think your father built a world where the truth would always find a way out. He knew Victor would never stop looking. He just needed you to be the one to bridge the gap." "The contractor didn't just lose his business, Julian," Lena said, her voice turning serious. "He lost the ability to ever make anyone feel small again. I saw the news this morning. The St. Jude's Foundation has been completely rebuilt. Victor funded the whole thing anonymously." "That's the Vane way," Julian smiled. "We fix the things that were built on lies. Speaking of fixing things." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I found this in the secondary encryption files. It's your father's real journal. Not the ledger he kept for the hunters, but the one he kept for you. It's full of sketches, book recommendations, and letters he wrote to you every year on your birthday." Lena felt a lump in her throat as she took the book. She ran her fingers over the leather, feeling the weight of a father's love that had survived the grave. "He never stopped being a librarian, did he? Always organizing the world so I could find my way through it." "He was the best of us," Julian whispered. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The romance between them hadn't been a sudden explosion. It was a slow, organic growth, rooted in the shared trauma of the night they met and nurtured by the quiet days that followed. It was a connection built on vulnerability and mutual respect, the exact opposite of the love Lena had seen modeled by Thomas Sullivan. Down in the garden, Victor looked up and caught Lena's eye. He raised a hand in a silent salute, a gesture of acknowledgement from one survivor to another. He had regained his sister, but he had also found a successor. He saw the way Lena looked at the world now, not with fear but with the calculated, protective gaze of someone who understood the value of peace. Sarah joined them on the terrace a few minutes later, her face glowing. "Victor wants to take us to Sicily," she said, her voice full of excitement. "To the old groves. He says the wooden bird carvings are still sold in the village square. He wants Lena to see where the little bird name actually comes from." Lena looked at Julian, then back at her mother. The contract of their old life was officially void. The house on Silver Lane had been sold, the proceeds donated to a shelter for domestic abuse survivors. Every trace of Thomas Sullivan's influence had been scrubbed from their lives, replaced by the deep ancient roots of the Vane family. "I'd like that," Lena said. "I'd like to see the beginning of the story." As the family gathered together on the terrace, the camera pans out, showing the grand estate surrounded by lush greenery and the shimmering blue of the distant ocean. The wrong number text hadn't just been an accident. It had been a catalyst for justice, a spark that ignited a war to end all wars. Lena felt the wooden pendant resting against her heart. She wasn't a victim anymore. She wasn't a secret. She was a Vane, and for the first time in her 17 years, she knew exactly who she was and where she belonged. The screen fades to a soft, warm amber as the final words appear. sometimes the wrong connection leads to the only right destination. The story of the little bird concludes not with a scream, but with a song of hope, echoing across the hills of a new life. All loose ends are tied. The villain is in a cage of his own making, the mother is restored, the uncle is redeemed, and the daughter is finally free to fly. We've reached the end of this incredible journey, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with us through every twist and turn. This story started with a moment of pure terror, a broken arm and a wrong number text, but it ends here in the light. It's a reminder that no matter how deep the shadows, there is always a way back to the people who truly know us. How did this ending make you feel? Are you as relieved as I am to see Lena and Sarah finally safe? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement is what keeps this channel alive. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. We have so many more emotional, high-stakes stories to tell, and I want you to be part of our family for all of them. Where are you watching from today? Let's celebrate this new beginning together.